They say evil doesn't always come with a knife or a gun. Sometimes it wears a smile and laughs while someone else bleeds. It was a quiet afternoon in Crestwood, a calm suburban neighborhood where life was supposed to be safe, ordinary, predictable. Children walked home from school in neat uniforms, neighbors waved at each other, and the sound of lawnmowers hummed across the streets. But on that particular day, behind the trimmed hedges and white fences, something dark waited. Her name was Emily Hayes, a 16-year-old girl with a quiet heart and a backpack full of dreams. She always walked home the same way, cutting through the side street near the abandoned lot. Her mother warned her to take the longer road, but Emily liked the calm there, the whisper of the wind, the scent of freshly cut grass, the feeling that the world slowed down for her. She didn't know that on this day, the world would turn against her. Two men sat by a black pickup truck parked carelessly near the old fence. They looked ordinary enough, work clothes, dusty boots, faces hardened by labor. But their laughter carried something sinister, something that made the air feel wrong. As Emily passed by, she felt their eyes crawl over her back. She clutched her bag tighter and picked up her pace. Then she heard it, the click of a latch, the low growl of dogs. At first she thought it was a mistake, but when the first bark shattered the silence, her heart froze. Two large dogs burst from the yard, teeth bared, claws scraping the concrete. Emily ran. The sound of their growls echoed down the street, sharp and relentless. Her shoes slapped against the pavement as she gasped for air. Behind her, the men were laughing, not shouting, not helping, just laughing. One of them yelled, "Go get her!" as if it were a game. Emily's legs burned, her breath caught. She stumbled, scraping her knee against the rough ground, but the sound of the dogs pulled her back up. She ran past houses, past parked cars, screaming for help. Curtains moved, doors cracked open, but no one came out. No one wanted to get involved. The world kept watching behind glass, pretending not to see. The dogs closed in, snapping at her backpack, tearing at the fabric. She let it go and ran toward the shop store, her heart pounding so loud she could barely hear her own screams. The shop owner stepped outside just in time, swinging a broom and shouting. The dogs stopped, confused, before the men whistled them back. Emily collapsed by the curb, trembling. Blood ran down her leg, her uniform torn, her mind broken. The men stood in the distance, smiling like it was nothing. One of them said something she couldn't hear, but she saw the way his lips curved. That smile, that's what stayed with her. That night she couldn't sleep. Every bark in the distance made her heart race. Every laugh outside her window made her feel small again. Her mother cried when she saw her injuries, but the police said there was no solid evidence. The men denied everything. They said the dog slipped out by accident. And that was that. No justice, no apology, just silence. For months, Emily avoided that street. She started walking home with friends, keeping her head down. But something inside her had changed. The light in her eyes dimmed. The laughter that once filled her home vanished. And slowly, fear turned into something colder, something sharper, something that waited. Years passed. The men moved on with their lives. One opened a small car repair shop on the corner. The other worked construction. They had wives, children, barbecues on weekends. They smiled in photos, shook hands in church, acted like good men. But behind their smiles, Emily's face sometimes flickered in their minds, the way she looked back when they laughed, the sound of her screams. It haunted them, though they'd never admit it. Until one day, something strange started happening. The first man, Todd, began finding things outside his shop. Little notes under his wiper with drawings of dogs. One note simply said, "They remember." He thought it was a prank, maybe from neighborhood kids. But the next morning, he found a collar hanging on his fence. His own dog refused to leave his kennel, whining, staring at the shadows. A week later, someone slashed his tires. Then his son's bike disappeared. Then one night, while he was locking up, he swore he heard barking, but the street was empty. He laughed it off, but his hands were shaking. The second man, Carl, wasn't spared either. He began receiving phone calls, heavy breathing, then silence. Once a voice whispered, "Do you remember her?" He hung up, angry, but his heart raced. He told Todd they were being messed with, but deep down, both men knew what this was. They just didn't want to say her name, because saying it meant facing what they did, facing what they laughed at, facing her pain. And guilt, when ignored, always finds a way back. Emily had grown. She was 26 now, quiet, reserved, living 2 towns away. But every scar had its memory, and every night when she looked at the mark on her knee, she remembered that day. The laughter, the fear, the humiliation. She didn't want revenge at first, she just wanted to forget. But forgetting was never an option, not when nightmares replayed the chase every time she closed her eyes. So she decided something. She wouldn't hurt them, not yet. She'd make them feel what she felt, helpless, watched, afraid of what they couldn't see. So she began to plan. She watched, she waited, she learned where they worked, where they lived, what they loved. She didn't attack them, she attacked their peace. Todd's dog went missing one night. No signs, no clues. Carl's wife found strange scratches on the back door, like claws. They called the police, but there was no trace of anyone. Then came the night Todd woke up to barking, his new dog going wild. He went outside with a flashlight, his breath fogging in the cold. There, on his front lawn, were dozens of dog collars, arranged in a circle. In the middle of them, a note. Do you remember how she ran? She thought she would have to do it herself, but some debts are too heavy to carry alone. Emily had a brother, Simon Hayes, 4 years older, who had left town the same year the dogs had chased her. He left without a fight, promising to send money home, promising he would be back, promising things he never kept. For years, Emily believed he had abandoned them. She believed he had chosen distance over duty. But Simon had not forgotten. He had listened to the story told in fragments across kitchen tables. He had read the silent language of Emily's face in photographs, and he had been living with a slow-burning guilt that made him move like a man with a file in his bones. When Emily started finding collars and notes, when Todd's tires were slashed and Carl's backyard bore the marks of claws, Simon called her one night and spoke 3 words that closed an old wound. I'm coming home. He came back not like a hero in a movie, not with a badge or a vendetta obvious to the street. He came back quiet, measured, a man who learned to wait and watch. He rented a room above a bakery 2 blocks from the repair shop and watched the men's routines, the way they drank coffee, the way they laughed at barbecues, the way they kissed their wives in the morning light without ever turning their heads to the children who passed the lot on their way home. He learned their names, their sins, their small comforts. He learned where their weaknesses lay. Revenge, Simon believed, was not a loud thing. It was a slow erosion of the thing they leaned on: safety. He began with small tremors, a delivery of fresh soil placed just so in front of Todd's shop, a collection of photographs, faded, anonymous, left behind a church pew where Carl's wife volunteered. The notes continued. They remember. But Simon was careful. He never touched their children. He never set a trap that would leave a mark on a child's laugh. He wanted their minds first. He wanted them to taste the helplessness Emily had swallowed for years. The men laughed at first, still cocky, still convinced the time had blunted their teeth. Todd hired a tow truck driver to patrol this lot. Carl bought an alarm system he bragged about to anyone who would listen. The collars kept appearing, but now they came with a twist. Some had names stitched into the leather, names that had nothing to do with the men, names from the past. Lena, Marie, Anne. Each name meant nothing to them on the surface, but Simon made sure they were placed where a neighbor, a passerby, a pastor might find them and ask questions. Rumors grew. Whispers wrapped around the men like a tightening band. Their wives began to ask about late nights, about who might be leaving those collars, about why their neighbors had started to cross the street when they saw them. That small social shifting was Simon's first victory. It took weeks. Then he moved on to the more personal hauntings, the kind that invade the solitary hours. Todd woke up in the middle of the night certain he had heard something, whining at the window, the small frantic yelp of a dog. He would get up, flashlight in hand, sweep the yard, find nothing, and then days later, a slow, soft scraping at the back door as if claws pressed for entry. He told his wife it was rodents. She comforted him out of habit. Carl received letters addressed to his workplace with no return address, single words written in a child's careful hand: run. These letters were not dramatic. They were spare, precise, the kind of message that crawled under a man's skin and slept there. Behind the scenes, Simon hired people, quiet, careful people who understood that fear could be a craft. A woman to sew collars that looked real but were impossibly old, a young man to drop anonymous packages at the edge of the men's property, an old dentist who kept his afternoons free to talk to the neighborhood boys and ask the right questions about the day the dogs broke loose. He fed the rumor mill in ways that never tied back to Emily or himself. He fed it so efficiently that even the men's friends began to squint at the things they had once excused. And yet, guilt is not only a whisper, it is a mirror. Simon targeted mirrors. He made sure Todd's shop had a billboard-sized reflection in the form of a community notice board plastered with a faded photograph of a girl in a school uniform, anonymous enough to avoid legal trouble, obvious enough to sting. The photograph would be put up by a hand wearing gloves at dawn, and by noon someone would have taken a picture and posted it to a local forum with the caption, "Who remembers her?" The comment sections bloomed with speculation. Is this from the old lot? Wasn't there something about dogs years ago? The men read those threads late at night with a beer in hand and a hand on their phones. They scrolled, they cursed under their breath. They tried to laugh, but the laughter started to catch. Simon never hit them. He made them hit themselves. He turned the town into a courtroom whose only evidence was memory and the men's own unwillingness to be small. Todd found his name misspelled in a payroll sheet and imagined a smear campaign, then saw the typo corrected and wondered if someone had done it on purpose. Carl's customers grew just a few degrees colder when he handed them a receipt. A handshake was no longer easy, and when a neighbor returned a smile with a sidewise glance, it felt like a verdict. Paranoia crept in like an old friend. Both men started measuring their time on the street. They left earlier, came home later. They pulled their curtains and checked locks twice. Their wives, sensing change, began to ask questions, and both men in that private place where guilt and fear meet lied louder than before. They told each other that the world was changing, that people were crueler, that they had done nothing wrong at all. That denial is loud and dramatic, but denial is brittle. What Simon wanted was not confession. He wanted the slow unmaking, the quiet concession to a knowing that nothing could be unremembered. So he escalated. He learned the men's smallest pleasures and stripped them piece by piece. Todd liked to keep a trophy shelf in his shop, old hubcaps, a framed photograph of him at 30. One morning, every trophy was rearranged just so. The photograph was turned to face the wall. It was subtle, childish even, but the point sank like a pebble. Carl loved his father's old watch. It went missing for a day, found under a pile of dog-eared magazines on his porch, with the clasp broken. Nothing lethal, nothing illegal, just loss. Then the men's working lives began to tighten. Supplies arrived late. A promising bid on a job went to a competitor at the last minute. A bank loan document sat on a table with a missing signature. Simon had friends in places, an accountant who owed him a favor, a supplier who ran late when asked to. Small inconveniences multiplied until they formed a pattern. The men paced at night. They collided in the grocery store and barked at each other like men who suspect poison at their cups. They met in the bar and drank too much and spoke too loud about nothing. Their lies became rope around their own throats. Neighbors who once waved now waved with hesitation. Parents who once let their children play near the lot began to cross to the other side of the street. The church that used to seat them near the front started to seat them further back. Someone joked about their stubbornness, and the laugh had sharp edges. The men felt the world tilt away from them in countless small ways, each one a tiny indictment. Simon watched all of it and never once met their gaze in the shop or on the street. He let the town do the work. He allowed the men to be haunted by a public opinion that smelled like judgment. While the slow terror unfurled, something else more intimate began to happen. The men woke from sleep not to the echo of pause, but to the whisper of memory. Todd began to dream of the day in fragments, a girl's backpack, a flash of white teeth, men laughing like it was a holiday. He would wake sweating, convinced he had left a window open, convinced that the sound of laughter in the street was real. Carl began to find himself replaying the image of Emily's scraped knee, but in this replay he could feel the scrape, the sting, the embarrassment, and his chest tightened as though someone had pressed a fist there. His wives noticed these changes, sleepless nights, a temper sharpened in ways that felt foreign. They asked for reasons and received evasions. That's what made the revenge so merciless. It didn't break them with fire, it drowned them in memory. The men started to turn on each other. Accusations began to leak in private bar conversations, idle comments that burned like acid. "You left the gate," one would say. "You were closer to the truck." The other would shrug, angry, defensive, and in that moment a new seed planted. "If I can be blamed, then maybe I am guilty." The uncertainty was Simon's blade. It was cleaner than any blow. The townspeople began to suppose they had seen something when they had not. Old men at the diner claimed now that they had heard the dogs that day. Women who had once kept silent now remembered details their minds had buried. Human memory is unreliable until it becomes a chorus. When enough voices hum the same tune, the tune becomes a fact in the street's mind. The men found themselves answering questions they could not fully recall being asked. They stumbled in conversations, saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. Once, at a church bake sale, a neighbor bumped Todd's arm and whispered, "We remember her." Todd's hand, mid-reach for a plate, froze. He swallowed and walked away. Shame walked beside him like a shadow that refused to be shaken. Months passed. Their businesses wobbled. Todd lost a contract that had been promised. Carl's foreman quit mid-shift, citing bad vibes. The men grew thin at the temples. They began to drink in the afternoons first, then at dawn too. Their sleeping was shallow, interrupted by a sense of being watched. Simon never touched them directly, but he did plant ideas in places of authority. He filed anonymous complaints about safety at the lot, citing dogs off-leash. He tipped off a local reporter about a small scandal involving unregistered animals. Nothing criminal, but enough to bring a pen to paper and a name to the page. Headlines rolled like small waves across the town's consciousness. Concerns raised over uncontrolled dogs in Crestwood. People read the article and wondered whose dogs, whose lot. Conversation ate at the men until their reputations were a thin skin stretched over raw nerves. Finally, the tipping point came not as a thunderclap, but as an expected sigh. During a community meeting to discuss neighborhood safety, Todd stood up to speak. He intended to defend himself and his property, to insist that whatever happened years ago was a fluke, a misunderstanding. But words failed him. He described haltingly that day in a way that made him smaller in his own ears.
Carl's voice trembled when he attempted to answer a question about his dog. Faces in the room, once familiar, looked at him with a sharpness that felt like accusation. A woman with careful hair, whose son had been in the playground that day, raised her hand and asked a precise question about why two men would cheer when animals got loose. Her voice was not cruel, it was simple, a question seeking the truth. The men froze. Simon sat in the back, a stoic figure with his hands folded, eyes dry. He had no need to speak. The town had already done its work. In the weeks that followed, the men's marriages frayed under the strain. Neighbors who once lent tools stopped answering the phone. They woke to missing tools from their sheds, to gas bills higher than expected, to anonymous calls in the night, recordings of a girl's laughter looped low and slow on their voicemail. Who did this, people asked. The town shrugged. Some said vandals, some said karma, some said that guilt fermented and turned people against themselves, but the men knew there was a pattern, a patient mind behind it. They suspected Simon only in the dark moments when they should have been ashamed to suspect him. They did not want the truth because the truth would be a confession, and they could not confess a thing they had not admitted to themselves. Paranoia became aggressive. Todd accused Carl of stealing parts. Carl accused Todd of slandering him to the bank. They argued in public, in front of customers, and looked like frightened men who had been caught in their own net. Their children grew awkward when their fathers were discussed at school. Friends stopped inviting them to weekend games. The men who once laughed now existed in a thin, isolated world where every smile toward them contained judgment. As their lives came undone, Simon watched the quiet justice take shape, one that did not require blood but demanded a reckoning. He did not gloat. He felt something close to sorrow. Revenge had been a medicine he swallowed to stay alive, but the medicine tasted bitter in his mouth. He had not wanted to create orphans of joy in their family homes. He had only wanted to carve a space of understanding for Emily. He had wanted the men to feel the small, everyday humiliation of being powerless. In the end, what he achieved was heavier than the act itself. Both men came to realize that someone remembered and someone had chosen memory over silence. That realization ate at them faster than any public shaming. Todd left town a month later, under the cover of night, taking only what he could carry and leaving behind a love seat, a television, and a shop that would be boarded up within the year. Carl stayed longer, but his clients thinned. His foreman left for a safer job, and his wife took the children to her sister's house for a month that stretched into forever. They did not die in dramatic fashion. They shrank. Their reputations, the thing that had once padded them like armor, thinned and frayed. They could no longer laugh in public with the same ease. That might have been enough for some, but Simon wanted more than disappearance. He wanted a final guilt to sit squarely on their chests so they could not sleep through it. He had never sought punishment to the body. He wanted interruption, an echo of the way Emily's life was interrupted. So he arranged one last thing. He organized, anonymously, a small exhibit at the local community center about memory and safety. It contained photographs, testimonies, careful, curated stories about moments children faced danger where adults looked away. The exhibit had no names, no accusations, only faces and questions. People walked through, read, remembered. At the center, in the dim lighting, hung a single framed photograph, an old grainy picture of a girl's school uniform, a scuff on her knee, a torn bag. Underneath, a plaque read simply, "We remember, so it won't happen again." Todd and Carl were invited as residents. They walked through the exhibit on an ordinary afternoon, shoulders hunched beneath that peculiar weight that towed spring to a man. Neighbors' eyes, the casual judgment of a quiet room. They lingered at the photograph, looking at the girl who had once run for her life. They read the plaque, and their knees loosened. Carl swallowed hard and left the room without a word. Todd's hand shook as he stepped outside and lit a cigarette with a hand that trembled. That day, for the first time since the dogs, the men understood that their small act had a name beyond a childish joke. They left the exhibit hollowed, and for the first time they reached for the one thing that could still act like a bandage: apology. Todd wrote one in a hand that had never had to be soft. He wrote to Emily's mother, to Emily, to anyone who would listen. The words came out clumsy and insufficient, but they were something. Carl, too, found his way to a note left at the community center. "I'm sorry," it read, ink blotched, a few sentences scratched in a way that suggested the hand that wrote them had been doing something it had not been used to: admitting. Emily read both letters in a kitchen that smelled of lemon polish and stale tea. She sat with them like relics and folded them into her pocket. She did not rejoice. Old wounds do not close at paper's touch. She felt only a long, tired relief, the kind that comes after a storm passes and the leaves are still wet on the ground. She knew that apologies could be small and still mean everything. She also knew that apologies could be a mask for a conscience finally woken. She put the notes in a box with other things she'd kept, the ripped backpack, a bracelet she had made at 10, and closed it. Justice, she knew now, had not been a single moment of triumph. It had been years of small reckonings that shifted a town's attention from indifference to memory. Simon visited her once, months after the exhibit, and they sat across from each other with cups of something warm between them. He said little, so much had already been said in the way he had orchestrated the unraveling, and she looked at him and saw not a villain, not a saint, but a brother who had come home carrying a careful plan to make the world feel the cost of a single laugh. They did not celebrate, they simply breathed. Two people who had been altered by the same wound, but had chosen different tools to survive. Years moved on. The lot was cleared and planted with a small community garden. Parents walked their children along the sunny sidewalk with an added watchfulness. The men moved away or melted into quieter lives. Sometimes you would catch a glimpse of them, an older man at the store with a hat pulled low, a face that refused to meet another's eyes. You would hear them tell a story at a bar and watch as the room cooled. Emily's scars faded and became stories she kept to herself. The laughter that had once followed her in nightmares grew smaller and less loud. Simon stayed nearby and helped where he could. He always watched the street as if waiting for the next wrong to right. In the end, the revenge did not grow teeth and bite back blood. It worked like a patient surgeon, removing the part of town that allowed cruelty to pass for humor. It forced reflection. It carved out a space where memory was an active thing, not a thing we let sit in drawers. The men who had once laughed were left with what they had carried all along, the unbearable knowledge that someone could remember and someone else could act. They suffered in small ways that multiplied until their lives could not bear the weight of them. That was Simon's justice, not spectacle, but the slow, deliberate collapse of certainty. And for Emily, justice was not a triumphant shout, but the quiet resettling of a life that had been nudged off its course, and then gently set back. In this town, the lessons settled into the sidewalks like a new grain of sand. People watched each other differently. That is how small towns change, not from single acts of wrath, but from the patient, unglamorous work of remembering and refusing to laugh when the vulnerable run past.
This was brought to you by Hidden Within. Kindly subscribe to our channel and don't forget to comment, like, and share.